Greetings. Perhaps some of you, well, I doubt it, if you've ever heard the story about a minister who gave a terrific 10-minute sermon. Unfortunately, it took him an hour to deliver it. A week ago, I spoke about fasting, and if you wanted more background on the fast of Gedaliah, the fast of the seventh month mentioned in Zechariah 8:19, you could go to Jeremiah 40, 41, and 42. One other comment about last week's message. I made a mistake in simple arithmetic. So anyway, the siege of Jerusalem began, according to the secular date, January 15th of 588 BC. And so that means between that day and the anniversary of it, which was a few days ago as I'm speaking, the 10th day of the 10th month on the sacred calendar, that would have been a lot longer than 7 biblical times. A biblical time, 7 biblical times, is 2,520 years. Now, why is that significant? That we can cover at another time. So with that bit of a tease, maybe more of you will want to we want to take a look at last week's message. For this week, and I am speaking just for those of you who are tuning in early after it is recorded, or for any information of those who may be seeing it years from now, I'm speaking on the last Sabbath in the secular year of 2023. So the next Sabbath will already be 2024. So today I want to talk about a sacred task completed. A sacred task completed. And I want to begin by what Jesus said in Luke 9. People have their way of trying to maybe not necessarily understanding fully what they're doing, but have other priorities in mind other than the kingdom of God. Other priorities wedge their way in there. And so Jesus said in Luke 9:62, and I'm quoting from the verse, am I in Luke 9? Yes, so I'll go now to the 62nd verse. But Jesus said to him, "No one, having put his hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God." One of my teachers used to tell us, "Hoe to the end of the row." And Jesus said this in John 4 and verse 34, a verse you're probably aware of. He says, Jesus said to them, John 4:34, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." And as he was about to be betrayed and arrested, tortured and crucified, he prayed this. John 17:4, "I have glorified you on the earth. I have finished the work which you've given me to do. And now, O Father, glorify me together with yourself, with the glory which I had with you before the world was." So we see that background. Today I want to talk about a servant of God who had a sacred task that he felt compelled to complete. And he did, with God's help, complete it. In fact, he did a lot of wonderful things. And as he accomplished these things, he kept appealing to God. And I want to go to Nehemiah. And I want to show you just how he finishes his book. The last phrase of the book, the end of verse 31 of Nehemiah 13. Nehemiah 13:31. He says, "Remember me, O my God, for good." And we remember Nehemiah for good. He accomplished quite a bit. Now back, as you know, the Jews had been exiled. They had come back from captivity. They had rebuilt their temple. But, things had deteriorated, and But in 457, Ezra had come to the Holy Land, a scribe, a priest, with the authority to actually enforce the Sinaitic covenant in Judea. So he was there, but after a while, things deteriorated again. Perhaps he had left the scene for a time. I'm speculating. We do see that he's back there in the 7th chapter of Nehemiah, very much a factor then, but no longer in charge. Nehemiah is in charge. So there may have been a time when Ezra was relieved of his leadership or temporarily left, and things deteriorated again. In any case, things were not in good shape in 445 BC as we look at Nehemiah, the first chapter. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hachaliah: it came to pass in the month of Kislev, that's the 9th month on the sacred calendar. I'm speaking now on the 18th day of the 10th month on the sacred calendar. It came to pass, which happens to be this year, December 29th. But anyway, Kislev is normally late fall and early winter. It came to pass in the month of Kislev in the 20th year. We're talking here about the reign of Artaxerxes, as you see in the next chapter. I was in Shushan, the citadel. So he's in ancient Persia, what is today Iran, and he had a very responsible position. He had to serve wine to the king, and obviously he had to be very trustworthy to do that. It may be, a friend of mine speculated, maybe he was kind of like a security guard for the king, kind of like the Secret Service nowadays that defend the president. But in any case, he had a relationship with the king. He knew the king well. That Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah, and I asked him concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. So he's talking about those that are back there now, no longer in Persia, no longer in Babylonia or wherever, but back in the land. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So evidently, the destruction that took place had not yet been fully rectified, or perhaps there even had been some new attacks. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned. For many days I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. Last week I spoke about fasting. When you fast, it gives you more time to pray and study if you're not having your meals and so on. And I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. Excuse me. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now, day and night, for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. So, unfortunately, even though the punishment had come, a partial restoration had come, but the people hadn't really, totally gotten back on track. You have acted very, of course, by this point, they had been spared an attempt to exterminate them. The book of Esther takes place between the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. So the intervention of God to save his people had already occurred. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But he continues to quote from Deuteronomy, or paraphrase it. God also said he'd bring them back. Right? And if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I've chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. And of course that had happened not so long before this prayer, during the time of Esther and Mordecai. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name, and let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. So he's going to ask permission from the head of this great empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. He's going to ask his permission to go back to the land of Israel, where the Jews were living, that remnant that had returned, and to straighten things out there. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, so that occurs in the spring, in the 20th year of King, and it's probably just about at the time when they would be ending their year and beginning the new year. The Persian New Year now is celebrated in the spring. I presume it was then too. So we're coming towards the end of that year from the Persian point of view, as far as I'm speculating on that. It came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. So evidently Nehemiah had a rather cheerful disposition generally. That may be one reason why the king he was chosen for that position. Therefore the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart." Well, a very perceptive man. So I became dreadfully afraid, because he didn't want to offend the king, but the king probably thought highly of him, wouldn't want to necessarily lose him, but he wanted to go back home, and back to to his ancestral homeland, and help out there. So I'll go on. And said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire?" Jerusalem is a very important, is, I suppose, in a way, the world's most important city from a biblical point of view. And, I could go on and on about that. But then the king said to me, "What do you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. So this shows you, if you're in a tight spot, you can pray right then instantly, even if people don't have to hear you necessarily either. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, "How long will your journey be? And when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, and I set him a time. So at some point Nehemiah did go back, and then he came again. And unfortunately, when he went back, things deteriorated. But while he was there, he really accomplished a lot. And I'm focusing today on the rebuilding of the walls of the city. If you go back to Daniel 9, there's a prophecy about that. About not only the rebuilding of the temple, but also the walls of the city. There's a prophecy at the end of Daniel 9 about that. The famous 70 weeks prophecy involves that. Anyway, furthermore, I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given to me, that the governors of the region beyond the river, the Euphrates, that they must permit me to pass through till I come to Judah." And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he must give me timber to make beams for the gate of the citadel which pertains to the temple, for the city wall, and for the house that I will occupy. And the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. So he certainly gave God the credit for this decision. God had influenced this decision. You see in the book of Ezra, right before Nehemiah, that God influenced Cyrus to make his decree. Then I went to the governors in the region beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent captains of the army and horsemen with me. Now it's unfortunate, but there were Gentiles living around where the Jews were, to the east of them, and then to some degree to the southwest. There were Gentiles that were unfortunately hostile, and were not happy about the Jews doing really well back in the Promised Land. By the way, does that sound familiar? Anyway, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard of it, they were deeply disturbed that a man had come to seek the well-being of the children of Israel. Now, these Gentiles who were hostile nevertheless, they did have interaction with the Jews. Later on, you'll see Sanballat had a daughter married to a grandson of the high priest, Nehemiah 13:28. So, in that sense, he had influence over influence inside the Jewish community. And you'll see Tobiah the Ammonite had relationships with important Jews. So particularly one leader is mentioned. I'll go to that in a little while. So in effect, there was a little bit of a fifth column there, as we say. There were Jews who had connections with these Gentiles who were actually hostile to the Jews. Anyway, so when he came at first, he kept a low profile in the beginning. He came quietly to observe the situation. Anyway, I'm in the second chapter. I've gone from the first to the second chapter. Now I'm in the 11th verse. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me. I told no one what my God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem, nor was there any animal with me except the one on which I rode. So, as I said, he kind of kept a low profile here. And I went out by night through the valley gate to the serpent well and the refuse gate, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates which were burned with fire. Must have been a very troubling experience, obviously. Just hearing about it troubled him, and now he sees it. Then I went on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal under me to pass. So I went up in the night by the valley and viewed the wall. Then I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. So he was viewing the devastation, the situation as it was, and far way below what the standard should have been for this capital of Judah, this city where the second temple had been built. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, or the others who did the work. Then I said to them, you see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire. Come and let us build a wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. So he rallied the people to get this job done, get the walls of the city rebuilt. Let's have a more respectful environment here for Jerusalem. Yerushalayim, Yerd HaKodesh we call it, right? The holy city. And I told them of the hand of my God which had been good upon me, and also the king's words they had spoken to me. So he had the backing of the ruler of that empire. And obviously behind, over that ruler was the sovereign ruler of the universe. So they said, let us rise and build. Then they set their hands to do this good work. So fortunately, they rallied to this sacred task. Nehemiah had convinced them to get involved with this. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they laughed at us and despised us and said, what is this thing that you are doing? Will you rebel against the king? Well, in this case, they were not trying to sort of build Jerusalem so as to split off from the Persian Empire. No, they were willing to be under the rule of King Artaxerxes, but they wanted to strengthen their position in the land of Israel, and they had the right to do it. So I answered them and said to them, the God of heaven himself will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will arise and build, but you have no heritage or right or memorial in Jerusalem. So he's telling them, you're not part of the Sinaitic covenant. You're in, a different spiritual situation, and so we're doing what we need to be doing. And we're going to do it as servants of God under the covenant, that we agreed to at Mount Sinai so many years before. And because of violating it, we were exiled from our land. Now we're back in our land, and we've determined now to get back on track positively. The first thing was to physically rebuild the walls. Later on, I might cover that at another time. I have covered it in the past. There was also a spiritual renewal, which you can read about in Nehemiah Did I say Nehemiah 7 earlier? I meant to say Nehemiah 8. It was on the first day of the 7th month, Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, or Yom Teruah, the day of trumpeting. On that festival day, Ezra was there. Nehemiah 8. So if I said Nehemiah 7 before, it's because I conflated the month with the chapter. So it's Nehemiah 8, and there you see the beginning of a spiritual renewal. And all through the book of Nehemiah, as you even in the 5th chapter, you see it. How he not only worked with the physical situation of the Jews, but with their spiritual condition, because they had been disunited and in effect preying on one another. Those who were very wealthy had been predatory towards those who had less. In other words, there was a lot to be fixed, not only in the physical sense but in the spiritual sense, the attitude of the people. But what's interesting is that at this time in history, you find a real repentance among the Jewish people and a renewal of the covenant. You can read about that, as I said, Nehemiah 8, 9, and 10. A renewal of the covenant that occurred shortly after the 8th day of sacred assembly, where there was a renewal of the covenant in 444 BC. A tremendous positive situation there among the Jews. So anyway, I'm going back now to the rebuilding of the wall, and Nehemiah 3 speaks of that work that they did to rebuild the wall, and names are mentioned here. It's that important, evidently, that even the people involved are mentioned. And of course, many of their descendants perhaps are there now. And in the future, I suppose, when in the millennium, people will be able to look back on these texts and see, their ancestors being mentioned here. Anyway, I go to Nehemiah 4. But it so happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall that he was furious and very indignant and mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren and the army of Samaria and said, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned?" So are they going to have some special ceremonies, special activities? Are they going to really be able to get this done? Now, evidently, the track record had not been good in recent years, but now things were different. Nehemiah had gotten them stirred up, and now they were going to do what needed to be done, as you see in the 3rd chapter. Excuse me. Now, Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, "Whatever they build, even if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall." So, in other words, they were hoping, this kind of wishful thinking on their part. It's not going to come to anything. It's going to be a failure. Well, no, it was not. It was successful. Here, God was behind it. Hear, O our God, Nehemiah says, right? "Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity." They are being hostile to us. Pardon me, we're not trying to harm them in any way. And yet they're trying to harm us. And really their argument is really with you. "Do not cover their iniquity, and do not let their sin be blotted out from before you, for they have provoked you to anger before the builders." So we built the wall, and the entire wall was joined together up to the half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Now it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites, that was somewhat. Ashdod is not that far from the region of Gaza that you're reading about now, heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night. Then Judah said, "The strength of the laborers is failing, and there is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall." It was not an easy thing to do. The job was difficult for the labor that they had available, the manpower they had available, but now they have hostile people wanting to attack them while they're doing it. And our adversary said, "They will neither know nor see anything till we come into their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease." So they were trying to make a sneak attack on them. So it was when the Jews who dwelt near them came, and they told us 10 times, from whatever place you turn, they will be upon us. So they had these warnings. Therefore I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall of the opening, and I set the people according to their families, with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. And this is very much like what we just celebrated a month ago, the Maccabees. You know, God took a group that was, in a way, you'd think that they would be the losers, but they wound up the winners. And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us, and that God had brought their plot to nothing, then all of us returned to the wall and everyone to his work. So the idea of a sneak attack, that was foiled. They didn't have the element of surprise. So it was from that time on that half of my servants worked at construction, pardon me, while the other half held the spears, the shields, the bows, and wore armor, and the leaders were behind all the house of Judah. Those who built on the wall and those who carried burdens loaded themselves so that with one hand they worked at construction and with the other held a weapon. If you look at the history of the modern state of Israel, this is very much like how it was developed before it became a state and even after. I'm in verse 18 now. Every one of the builders had his sword girded at his side as he built, and the one who sounded the trumpet was beside me. Then I said to the nobles, the rulers, and the rest of the people, the work is great and extensive, and we are separated far from one another on the wall. Whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. So he was organizing this group, and whatever, even though there were difficult conditions, he did the best he could, and God honored what he did. So we labored in the work, and half of the men held the spears from daybreak until the stars appeared. At the same time I also said to the people, let each man and his servant stay at night in Jerusalem, that they may be our guard by night and a working party by day. So evidently people had come from other areas into the capital city to serve in this way. So they were sacrificing to get this job done. So neither I, my brethren, my servants, nor the men of the guard who followed me took off our clothes, except that everyone took them off for washing. So they had to stay on the alert constantly. And now we go to the 6th chapter, and we see that the enemies of the Jews couldn't surprise attack them, so they tried to work out some plot where they might assassinate Nehemiah, or they might demoralize them through prophecies that would indicate that you're gonna fail. You know, whatever they could do to influence events negatively, they were going to do it. So I'm going to refer briefly here. I'm in Nehemiah 6. So it happened when Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall, and that there were no breaks left in it, though at that time I had not hung the doors on the gates. Then Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, come, let us meet together among the villages in the plain of Ono, but they thought to do me harm. And so you can keep reading about these various plots that failed. The work continued. Nehemiah continued in his leadership, and the work continued. Okay. Now the ancestry of these people is given. It doesn't mean that everybody from that ethnicity is condemned, but their background is given here. But it shouldn't be a cause for any kind of bigotry. But it is just interesting to see the background of those people who were hostile at the time. All right. Anyway, I want to go back. I want to go down now to verse 15. So the wall was finished. Okay, whatever plot was laid failed. So the wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul. That's the 6th month on the sacred calendar. Late summer, in 52 days. And it happened when all our enemies heard of it, and all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by our God. So they saw that God had to be behind it, because Well, we have an idiom in English based on baseball. They had 2 strikes against them, yet they did it. And let me just read on here, because I talked earlier about how there were some Jews who were involved with these Gentiles, a kind of a fifth column, but it still didn't succeed in stopping the work. So now I'm in verse 17. Also in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came to them. Let me go back to a verse that I should have read, and that is the 14th verse. Here Nehemiah says, "May God remember Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who would have made me afraid." So evidently they tried to have spiritual people, prophesy against what they were doing, and of course that didn't work either. Now I want to jump down to verse, back to verse 17. Also in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters to Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came to them. For many in Judah were pledged to him. Wow. Because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Ara, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, who is a leader of the Jews. You can read in Ezra 8:16, the son of Berechiah. Also they reported his good deeds before me and reported my words to him. Tobiah sent letters to frighten me. So there were all kinds of methods trying to use to demoralize and undermine the work, but it came to naught. God was behind it. The work was done. The wall was completed in 52 days. Now the walls of Jerusalem were complete. A sacred task completed. And now we can go on to the 7th chapter, and you have some historical background here, but then finally you come to the end of the 7th chapter. I'm going to try to flip the page here and get to the end of the 7th chapter. And this almost tempts me to go to a device, because it's hard to flip the pages here. Here we go. So when we come to the end of the 7th chapter, it says, verse 73, so the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, some of the people, the Nethinim, these were servants in the temple, and all Israel dwelt in their cities. So everything was organized. Things were getting back on track. When the 7th month came, the children of Israel were in their cities. But now we go to the 8th chapter, and we see that they gathered together in Jerusalem for the Festival of Trumpets, and a tremendous spiritual revival began at that time. So we went from a physical restoration of the nation to a spiritual restoration. It's very inspiring as you continue to read the book of Nehemiah. He worked hard to get them back on track regarding Sabbath observance and regarding having proper respect for the covenant at Sinai and their responsibility as the chosen people, a remnant of the chosen people, because the northern tribes had disappeared from history, but the southern kingdom still had that identity as Israelites, as people of the covenant, and they were divided into 3 groups basically: priests, Levites, and Israelites, most of whom were, of course, descendants of Judah. Also, we had many from Benjamin, if you read the Bible there. So this was the remnant of Israel, and they had a responsibility, and God would bless them if they indeed did what was required of them. And he did bless this effort of Nehemiah and Ezra. You'll see that in chapter 8. Ezra is also mentioned now. So he's back there now. He might have been gone for a time, but he's back there now. So we see the completion, that a sacred task was completed. It's very inspiring to read it. And it's interesting because it almost sounds like a reading out of a newspaper when I read this material. But I want to go to the book of Philippians to conclude. You see, God has chosen those whom he wants to be kings and priests in the millennium. And he's in effect doing a work in them. And he intends to complete that work. In spite of ourselves, he is going to complete it. if we remain in cooperation with his goal for us. In other words, if indeed we seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, as Matthew 6:33 tells us, if our goal is in line with God's goal for us, and if our life shows that, is illustrative of that, then God indeed will complete the sacred task, and he will put us in the New Jerusalem, because he intends to do that. Philippians 1 and verse 6. Paul writes here, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Indeed, a sacred task completed. All the best to you and yours.